Hello, welcome everybody. This is Michael Urban, not Michael McMahon, who's actually handed over to me today to chair this seminar because he decided to go back to traveling. So those who are stable in their offices need to take over here today. Great pleasure. We have Luba Petersen here today. She was supposed to already give the last seminar and then could unfortunately not make it. So we're very happy to have you now today here with us, Luba. I'm sure all of you know her work. I mean, she's doing extensive laboratory and survey work on central bank communication. And she will talk today about communicating uncertainty. And for everyone here in the audience, the idea is, as usual, we would have an hour roughly of talk, 15 minutes of discussion time. If you have any comments, just put them in the chat and then we'll convey them to Luba. So Luba, the floor is yours. Great to have you.
Thank you very much. Well, first, let me thank the organizers, the Michaels, for the opportunity to reschedule this presentation. Last month, I got very sick and I was totally out of it and unable to present. But now today I'm a lot better and I'm excited to be talking to you about communicating uncertainty. I'm going to be focusing on central bank communication of uncertainty. And as Michael alluded, I'm going to be discussing some recent lab and survey evidence on this. We, needless to say, live in a world of varying degrees of uncertainty. And central banks are often faced with the challenge of deciding how much of that uncertainty to convey to the public. It has uncertainty about many things, not only how the economy is structured and how it evolves, but also about the shocks that are occurring in the economy now and also in the future. Central banks even face some uncertainty about what their mandates will be and their objectives and what exactly they're going to aim to accomplish. Now, in that world, broadly speaking, central banks face a trade-off. They have to trade off strike a balance between being transparent about what it does and doesn't know, while at the same time instilling confidence in the public that they can manage the economy. And a very confident, precise message may be easier for the public to remember or understand. It might signal that the economy is on a stronger trajectory, but it also has the risk of the public becoming too confident and too focused on specific point estimates and not taking into consideration the risks or the background risk the central bank is operating in. Now, central banks communicate their uncertainty in various ways, and their publications are usually the most kind of salient way in which they convey their risks, in particular in their projections visually. You can see across various central banks, there are different strategies for communicating uncertainty. You've got some central banks like Korea and the Bank of Canada that provide precise point forecasts, either as numerically or as visual point forecasts. Some convey just the risks or the broad confidence intervals that they have. Some provide point forecasts in the middle of those forecasts. Others go so far as kind of conveying the range in the outlooks of members of their voting committees or within their monetary policy councils. Some, especially during the pandemic, have gone so far as showing scenarios, different scenarios to the public, upside or say downside risks to the economy. And even within these projections, central banks can be very transparent about their past performance by publishing also their past forecasts alongside with the current state of the economy, as well as their own targets within their projected path. Now, we also see communication of uncertainty done in written forms through particularly statements or monetary policy reports. Typically, the uncertainty conveyed there is measured through either word counts, which have a way of conveying uncertainty by means of explanation, and explicitly through the use of words classified as uncertain or tentative. And so I had an RA put together some recent measures of these uncertainties or tentativeness over time for recently with the Bank of Canada, the Fed, and ECB. And what you can see here is that during the pandemic and also the first mentions of Russia's war on Ukraine, there was where we had heightened uncertainty, much like in the start of the financial crisis, there was a spike in words being used by central banks. In the case of the ECB, it was also associated with initially more tentativeness in the language that they were using. Now, in addition to explicit discussions of risks to outlook and visually in projections, we even see central banks be tentative in the way that they present inflation targets. Some central banks are very precise about what their objectives are. They may have a precise point forecast or a point target, or they will convey that together with a dual mandate. Some central banks provide their point targets within a range, and some don't even provide a point target, they just convey a range. I want to drive home this point of this general heterogeneity of central bank communication just a little bit more. If you go and you look at individual central bank websites, the front page that public sees, there's a lot of variation across central banks in what information they make salient to the public. So yesterday I was checking out the Bank of Canada's webpage, and what I noticed is that the Bank of Canada is very transparent about inflation statistics. They list all the different kinds of statistics that they're focused on when making their policy decision. What struck me as a bit odd here was that the Bank of Canada is a very proud inflation targeter. It's very proud of the fact that it's done so well at managing inflation, around 2% over the last 20 years. And generally pleased with the fact that, you know, the public understands this 2% inflation target. But it's interesting to me that there's no indication nowadays about that bank's 2% target or the range in which the bank is operating in, that 1 to 3% range. By contrast, the Bank of England makes very clear what current inflation is, but in smaller font, it's 2% inflation target. And last, the ECB, well, it indicates that it's concerned about keeping prices stable, but much of the focus is on climate change on that front page. There's no mention of inflation statistics or targets. Now, my point with all this is that how central banks say they communicate with the public and how they actually do are two different things. The direct information that people are getting by visiting these front pages differs very much from what macroeconomists and we researchers in this literature perceive as communicated. So while the the ECB has an explicit 2% inflation target, it's not being made very salient to the public here. Now, there are so many different ways in which central banks can communicate to the public and the different informations of what they communicate. And that communication evolves quite quickly from one month to the next as the world evolves around central banks. So it can be very challenging empirically to disentangle the effects of these different communication strategies. So one way this literature has been evolving is by using controlled experimentation, by systematically varying the type of information people receive, either through from some external source, quote unquote, perhaps a central bank. We can learn from that, broadly speaking, how behavior changes. Now, ideally, we would like to be able to rerun the economy over and over again and provide people with different pieces of information and see what kind of information helps to anchor inflation expectations and to help people better understand, as well as understand the economy and just build credibility of the central bank. But we can't do that. So survey experiments and laboratory experiments, as I'm going to explain shortly, are an alternative strategy of learning how people can, what kinds of information people can learn effectively. And Luba, as I'll explain, yes?
Can I start with the first interruption here? I mean, obviously, one comment, I did look up the ECB's website, and we actually have a time series plot of the inflation rate, only a little bit further down. So, I mean, on the top of the website, sort of the latest publication, but there is a time series plot which sort of shows how inflation is really dramatically increasing. So it's there. It depends a little bit, you know, where you're looking for. But more substantively, I was wondering, you know, what we've discussed here in this forum very often is central banks don't actually reach necessarily, at least the public, via their websites or via their projection exercises, right? But, you know, has anyone looked at whether different ways of communicating get reflected differently in media reporting? Because, you know, very often we think like whether we do a fan chart or we do bands around an inflation projection, what the media is going to report is, you know, they try to find the middle line, and then that's everything that goes into media. So has there been anyone, or have you looked at this, whether some of these measures are more successful in actually conveying that uncertainty all the way to the public?
No, and I find there's very little empirical work actually looking at uncertainty in particular. So, but I think that it really varies from one central bank to a next. There's a lot of I don't get the impression that that's been really examined. No. That's why there's been increasingly more survey work looking at how to communicate uncertainty. And this is part of the reason why Olen and I get into this, as I'll explain. But there have been responses by central banks because of what the media likes to focus on. So there's a very nice paper that I cited earlier here by Eichmann and his co-authors by Bank of England staff discussing the Bank of England's reluctance to convey point estimates at the concern that the media over focuses on that precise point forecast, and consequently that can risk losing central bank credibility. Now, so what I want to talk about today are two means by which central banks or central bank communication of uncertainty is kind of evaluated in laboratory settings or survey settings. The first is the one that you're probably more familiar with. These types of experiments, survey experiments, are typically conducted on households and firms that participate broadly in surveys. In these sorts of settings, households and firms submit forecasts or hypothetical decisions, and usually that's done for a flat fee. They're individually asked about their outlooks about the economy over some horizon, say 1 or 2 years, maybe longer. And in the background, as they're making these forecasts, what they have in mind is the economy that they're actually engaging in, the real world. Now, in survey experiments, typically participants are then randomized into information treatments where they either receive no additional information or some pre-selected information in relation to the central banking communication literature. This is usually inflation statistics, inflation targets, or projections. Then the participants are then resurveyed, typically right after, and then down the road, say 3, 6, or 12 months later. And I would say that these kinds of experiments are particularly useful in highlighting how heterogeneous populations respond to different types of information. The nice thing about surveys is that you can get a very representative population if you use a larger surveying company. And depending on the source, you can actually connect that data with real decisions, either household consumption, saving decisions, or possibly investment decisions. So you can actually see the real effects of such information on people's behavior. By contrast, laboratory experiments, in lab experiments, people make decisions or forecasts in a virtual economy with other people. These other people typically are undergraduate students, but more effort these days is put towards getting representative subject pools into the lab. Now, in these virtual economies, participants' actions are going to have some endogenous effect on the economy. Okay? There's going to be an underlying structure to the economy, and the combination of people's decisions or their beliefs and perhaps some exogenous shocks are going to be what drive the economy. Now, a lot happens in a relatively short amount of time. These are 2-hour experiments, and usually about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes is spent with the participants making active decisions in these virtual economies. So 1 to 2 minutes in these games translates into about 1/4 in an economy. And to motivate participants to take their decisions seriously, they're paid. So on their performance. So if they're making forecasts, they're paid based on their forecast accuracy. If they're making consumption saving decisions, they'd be paid based on the utility that would be associated with those decisions. And the more points they earn in these games, the more money they get at the end of the experiment. Now, in these kinds of experiments, when information is communicated or provided to the participant, it's usually provided to the entire economy. And typically, it's repeated every single period of this game. So it's intense, continual communication of information. This is different from information interventions or how central banks actually communicate with the public, in that the information is often one-shot or infrequent, and the survey participants don't know if the rest of the economy is also aware of this information. Now, there are some advantages of going to the lab. One, you can create whatever scenario you're interested in understanding, whether or not it's actually existed in the real world, and you can see how it plays out. So in particular, you can learn whether people can learn to or not learn to coordinate on information. And because you have so many repeated forecasts over this 1 to 2 hour game, you can collect a lot of data at the individual level. And that allows you to identify the forecasting heuristics that people are employing when they're forming their expectations. And moreover, you can more clearly identify whether a person is behaving in a model consistent or rational way, because you have a clearer sense of their information sets. Now, I want to say, before I talk about the literature, there's certainly a trade-off by going to the lab. That additional control you have over the information sets and the control you have over the environment that people are coming or interacting in comes at a cost of a lack of external validity, either because maybe the underlying economy is may or may not represent or describe the real economy effectively, or it could be that the participants being studied are not sufficiently representative. Now, both of those can be, worked around by, trying out different underlying DGPs or using a broader sample of participants. But despite these limitations, what we're seeing is that there's quite a growing literature using the lab to study expectations, and in particular, central banking questions. And the focus in this literature has been, I think, twofold. First, a lot of work has looked at how to design monetary policy in an effort to manage expectations. And then second, how to design central bank communication. A consistent finding in this literature, and I would also say in the survey literature, is that people are not very forward-looking. Okay, instead, they rely very heavily on recent inflation experiences to form their expectations. So much of the goal of, I think, the central bank communication literature is to understand how can we encourage people to look less at the past and more into the future as they form their expectations. All right, now, one very widely used framework to study expectations is called the Learning to Forecast experimental framework. And in these types of experiments, participants are playing the roles of professional forecasters. They're tasked each period with forming macroeconomic expectations, typically inflation, sometimes output. And these might be for one period ahead or many periods ahead. And these expectations are then used by automated households and firms in this economy to generate real and nominal outcomes. Underlying these experimental economies is a DGP that is, typically based on some well-known macroeconomic model. It's going to be driven by the aggregate expectations and shocks. In a single economy, you're going to have about 7 to 10 participants and for about 2 hours interacting together. We think of each session or each group as a single economy. And typically, as we experiment with communication, we do this in a between subject manner, not a within subject manner. So meaning independent groups of participants are systematically provided with different information when they come into the experiment. You can design this in different ways. You can implement information in the course of the experiment, and then you could do this in a within subject manner. Now, the underlying data generating process that you typically use for these learning to forecast experiments comes from standard macroeconomic models. There's a lot that one can use for this, but it's important that for learning to forecast experiments, to study expectation formation, that there's an important role for expectations to be driving aggregate dynamics. When we use a learning, like a new Keynesian learning to forecast framework, we typically take the median or the mean forecast of a group of participants each period, and we feed that into the DGP together with some shocks. So either disturbances to the natural rate of interest or to supply shocks. There's a central bank that's going to be operating in the background, and it's going to set its policy rate according to some pre-specified rule. Now, in the communication relevant experiments, independent groups are going to receive different information about particularly the DGP, but all in particular about the nature of monetary policy. So be it the central bank's inflation target, their outlook for their policy rates, or their outlook for the future for inflation or output. Now, in these experiments, the game evolves typically as follows. So after participants have been provided with information about the economy that they're going to be interacting in, the instructions of the game, they're going to start playing in an environment together where they're going to repeatedly form forecasts about the future. They're going to have that information about the data generating process. They're going to see historical information up to that point in time. And depending on the experiment, they may also see information about the current state of the economy, so fundamentals or shocks to the economy. Each period, participants are then going to simultaneously submit their forecasts for future macroeconomic variables. Those forecasts are going to get aggregated and then fed into the economy's data generating process to allow the economy to evolve. And this is just going to repeat over and over again. Now, so before I go on, let me say an important assumption when we're using these types of laboratory experiments, these learning to forecast experiments, is that we're assuming that the agents in the economy, the automated households and firms, are going to be acting on these expectations. Now that's something that we're taking for granted. In many instances, you can imagine in the real world, people may form expectations about the economy, but they're unwilling to act. If you actually want to study how people are willing to act on their expectations, you can build a different type of laboratory experiment, production economy experiments, something that Ryan and I have been working on, where we can more effectively examine the link between expectations and real decisions. But for simplicity, much of the literature is focused on this particular framework because it allows us just to concentrate on the expectations of participants rather than additionally on their real decisions. Okay, so Ryan and I have done extensive work looking at how to communicate projections. In some of my earlier work with Fatima Mokhtarzadeh, I learned that inflation projections, particularly constructed using very model consistent in a very model consistent way, assuming that individuals in the economy or agents in the economy form rational expectations, can work very effectively to guide non-rational individuals to forecast in a more model consistent way. But what was unclear from that earlier work was whether it made a difference whether you communicated those projections precisely as a point forecast, or whether it mattered whether you communicated with a confidence interval around that. So Ryan and I have been exploring this question for a couple of years, both before and after the pandemic, or as the pandemic has evolved. And in the experiment that we conducted, we had participants submit 4 types of forecasts each period in our experimental economy. Each period, they would submit forecasts about 1 and 2 period ahead inflation. And we also asked them to submit forecasts about what they thought their own forecast error would be. The point of this was to understand to what extent participants were uncertain about their forecast, and to understand how that uncertainty changed as we varied the way that the projections were presented. So using a between subject design, so across different independent groups of participants, we varied the information that the central bank provided to participants in terms of the precision of that information. So in our no communication treatment, we provided no additional information to participants about the central bank's outlook. Our point projection treatment showed participants a projection of inflation for the next 5 periods. I'll show you a visual of this in a sec, where the projection was constructed under the assumption that individuals would, or the participants in the economy would form ex-ante rational forecasts. And a third treatment where we included a 1 standard deviation confidence interval around that point forecast. On participants' screen, which was a Chrome browser, participants could see a variety of variables evolve over time. They could see inflation and in 1 and 2 periods ahead evolve on their screen, the second and third panels here. They could see their own forecasts in blue and gold, as well as the uncertainty that they communicated about their own forecasts. If the central bank provided a projection, it would be shown to them as a 5 period ahead path for inflation. And perhaps, and in some treatment, in one of the treatments, it was also presented with a confidence interval around it. They could see shocks to the economy and the interest rate evolve also on their screen. On the left side of their screen, they would input their forecasts for 1 and 2 period ahead inflation, as well as their own forecast error. And then as the economy evolved, they could observe how their performance as their total points evolved. So what we found when we conducted this experiment was that actually forecast performance didn't improve significantly by giving people these projections. So here you can see our estimate. So you can think of this alpha here as a constant. This is our baseline treatment here. And what this is saying is that, the average forecast error here for our no communication treatment was about 36 basis points, which is relatively small. And perhaps this is not surprising because participants had complete information about the environment that they were in, and they understood the DGP. So compared to people in the real world, that's quite high amount of information. So perhaps it's not so surprising that these are quite small. But the additional provision of a point forecast or a point density didn't really do too much to help manage those 1 period ahead inflation forecasts or reduce the forecast errors. But they did help with further ahead forecasts because they helped to guide inflation expectations back towards the economy's steady state. But we do see a difference between point forecast and point density. Those are shown in our second and fourth columns here. So the constant here refers to the mean forecast errors in the point treatment, and the coefficient here on point and density is the additional increase or change in forecast errors in that point and density treatment.
Luba, can I interrupt again? So one question from my side, and there's something in the chat here. I mean, I presume this matters how wide sort of the uncertainty is that the central bank is communicating. So have you experimented with this? I mean, I don't know, if it's wider ex ante than what they anyway perceive to be the uncertainty. And
no, well, one thing is that you can see, I mean, as the uncertainty does get larger as you get further out. And we haven't examined that, but that's a great question. And something we could look at is whether the projection, I mean, you can see it a bit here from the point estimates for the 2 period ahead forecasts. You see slightly worse forecast errors, but it's hard to say. But that's a fair point that one could vary this, the degree of that range.
I mean, my own prior, of course, is the further out the horizon, the more uncertain I am anyway. So I wouldn't be surprised if also the central bank interval widens up, right? But it's probably how wide is the central bank interval relative to my prior interval?
Yeah. And one thing one can do here is also provide different levels of confidence, much like how the Bank of England does, so that you can see if that makes a difference too. But that's something that's easily introduced here.
And then there's a question here in the chat: to what extent, further to just providing these numbers in the projections, the sentiment conveyed in the statements, speeches would influence this. I guess this is beyond what you've been doing there.
Yeah, but one thing I can say about that is that I have worked with communicating qualitatively and quantitatively in lab settings. So studying forward guidance at the ZLB in some earlier work with Yasmina Rifovic, and we communicated qualitatively or quantitatively. And when monetary policy isn't working very effectively, the qualitative communication was more effective at managing expectations, somewhat more effective at managing expectations than being very precise about your outlooks. Which I think it makes sense because by being qualitative about where you see the economy heading, it's hard for participants to lose credibility in what you're saying as opposed to a precise forecast. But certainly you could, within these frameworks, you can easily introduce language through messaging to the participants, perhaps as like an information box here on the left. And you can vary the way that you present the language to the participants. In some recent experimental work that I've been doing with Olena Kostashina to study price level targeting and its ability and how to manage expectations in a PLT setting, we have one additional treatment there where we have to provide a lot of additional communication to help guide expectations when the economy goes into the ZLB. And projections alone are not sufficient to guide expectations. Having the additional kind of rationalization about why the central bank is, say, adjusting interest rates to achieve a particular objective is necessary to guide that, to more effectively coordinate expectations.
Could I jump in with another question?
Sure.
Do you have any notion whether participants found it more complex to interpret those density forecasts rather than just point forecasts? So maybe they're more used to point forecasts and they found it just harder. There was some uncertainty to understand it. And then maybe also there was some higher belief story that they weren't sure if other people might understand it differently and that caused some uncertainty.
Let me get to that.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm gonna say a bit about that. So when we look at disagreement, we see that disagreement is lower when people are presented with a precise point forecast, but we don't see a consistent improvement in the disagreement among participants when they're given information with a confidence interval around it, suggesting that confidence interval doesn't manage expectations as well or as consistently. And when we look at uncertainty, we see the same thing. Uncertainty in participants' own forecasts go down by 35% when they're presented with a point forecast, but they go up slightly with a point and density forecast. But compared to a point forecast itself, the density forecast makes people more uncertain about their own forecast. So maybe that gets at your question, Alina, that people seem less confident in their engagement with the economy and perhaps this projection when they're given more and precise information.
And do you notice changes over time? So the longer the experiment goes on, no, okay.
No, so this is so we have the game play out for 30 periods, and then we stop, we reset the economy, and we redo it with a second set of 30 periods. And we don't see significant differences before and after we reset. So in that later phase, when people are more experienced, they don't seem to treat that uncertainty differently. So, all right, so one additional thing we can do with this, this very lengthy panel data that we have a lot of observations at the individual level on forecasts. We can classify people into one of many forecasting heuristics. So there's, broadly speaking, 7 general forecasting heuristics that people tend to use in these laboratory experiments. And what we see is that without any projections, people have difficulty forming their beliefs or expectations in a very model consistent way. Something like only 14% of participants can be described as rational, given the model and the information sets that they're provided. Rather, they use a variety of backward-looking heuristics, adaptive forecasting, as well as updating based on their past forecast errors using a constant gain learning model. And there's a bit of trend chasing in their expectations. Providing participants with a point forecast works impressively in this environment to nudge people to form in a more model consistent manner. And it reduces their usage of backward-looking forecasting heuristics. A point and density projection, by contrast, is a little less effective at nudging people towards more forward-looking behavior. Okay. So from this, what we concluded is that it was generally better to provide people with precise projections. Okay, so forecasts that have densities around them, they tend to not have much improvement on forecast accuracy. They tend to increase disagreement and uncertainty. And we also found that central bank credibility was more fragile when participants had a point and density forecast. So in particular, when the central bank made larger forecast errors, people were less likely to use the central bank's projection when it was presented with a density around it. When it was presented precisely, the participants were more forgiving of the central bank and continued to use that projection, even if it was less accurate. Okay, so we finished running those experiments, and we finished them in about fall 2019. So we were pretty pleased with the results and very confident that we understood something about central bank communication. And then the pandemic happened, and in spring 2020, we noticed that many central banks changed the way that they were presenting their projections. The Bank of England and the Fed increased the precision in their outlooks, while you saw central banks like the ECB, the RBA, RBNZ all become less precise in their first MPRs following the onset of the pandemic. The Bank of Canada, which has been consistently publishing point projections, shifted dramatically to publishing just a range of outlooks in their April 2020 MPR. And when I saw that, I nearly died after seeing what Ryan and I had been working on. And then later on in July and then in October, they started introducing back that point and then into their forecast, and then removed the density around their forecast. Okay? But so after having seen our results, we wondered, well, whether the way in which central banks had shifted their communication made sense, and maybe it was better to convey, it wasn't clear to us whether it was better to convey confidence or to be transparent about what you don't know. And so we decided to go back to the lab and see whether people's attitudes towards uncertainty changed during the pandemic. So we reran our experiments both in spring 2020, right at the onset of the pandemic, and then again in fall 2021, when the pandemic severity had significantly dissipated. We also had the opportunity to take advantage of the variation in COVID severity across our 2 locations. So in BC, COVID was not so severe, whereas in Texas, they had significantly higher incidences of cases and deaths. And so we could exploit that difference in the severity of background uncertainty to understand how that played into the sensitivity to communicated confidence. So we replicated our experiment in 2 waves. In early COVID, we reran online as opposed to being in the lab, because all of our labs had to be shut down because of health concerns. And so 2 things might have changed there. They're going from pre-COVID to post-COVID. There may have just been this increase in background uncertainty that might be changing people's behavior, or it could be due to the fact that people were now engaging in an online experimental interface as opposed to in the lab. So when we reran in our late COVID sessions in fall 2021, this should say 2021 here, we reran both in the lab and in an online setting just to control for those setting effects. And so what do we find? So what I'm going to do is walk you through the no communication results. So pre-COVID, this our constant here, we had pretty small forecast errors, about 35 and 42 basis points for 1 and 2 period ahead forecasts. We don't find much effects from having gone through COVID, either in the early onset of the pandemic or in late COVID. There's not much of an online effect. So by and large, this learning to forecast framework is pretty robust to these background, this background uncertainty due to COVID. But in our point forecasting treatment, we observed some notable effects of COVID, early COVID. Early in the pandemic, people started making larger forecast errors. They were deviating more from the rational expectations equilibrium, so they weren't using the projections as frequently. For further ahead forecasts, they were more disagreeing. So, we took this as perhaps being driven by some COVID effect. Now, I'll show you that in the point and density treatments, we saw the opposite behavior. COVID seemed to encourage more rational forecasting and consequently improved forecast performance. There was less disagreement about it from our participants. We found that those effects dissipated as the pandemic evolved and the background uncertainty declined. We also observed that the setting mattered. So being in an online interface seemed to worsen participants' performance more than it did in the point treatment. And one possibility one reason that might be the case is that participants are more distracted when they're interacting in an online interface at home, where they could be surfing the net or just checking their emails during the experiment, and they weren't as focused in the experiment. And so providing more precise information seemed to at least better coordinate their expectations when they had these background distractions. What you see in terms of forecasting behavior is that when presented with no information, additional forecast or projections, participants' heuristics didn't really change very much across the pandemic. We see bigger shifts in the heuristics people use in point and density as the pandemic evolved. So in the point treatment, we saw people less willing to use that precise point forecast and more willing to use the point and density forecast early on in the pandemic. And then things started reverting back to normal in late COVID. But it doesn't seem like the setting itself played much role in shaping the heuristics that participants used to form their forecast.
Sorry, Luba, me again.
Sure.
Clarification question. So the central bank forecast is based on the true underlying model of the economy, right? Yeah. Now, that might not be the case in the real world, right? I mean, we might have the completely wrong forecasting model, right? And so, I mean, what you sort of say, it's actually good to publish a point forecast, I think must depend on the central bank knowing the structure of the economy.
Exactly, yes. But central banks have many models that they relied on even during the pandemic, right? And they could and while there is model uncertainty, like in our experiment, while the central bank was publishing their projection, it was under the assumption that the economy would evolve in a rational way. So the central bank in our economy too was making forecast errors as they went along because participants weren't forecasting in exactly a rational manner. But the point forecast worked well to coordinate expectations towards that rational expectations equilibrium solutions. And so by nudging people in that direction, it actually made the central bank's projections more accurate.
Right.
Now I've run other experiments where instead, let's assume that these projections weren't constructed under the assumption that people were rational, but actually let's use a better model of people's behavior to construct those projections. So let's introduce some adaptiveness in the projection based on the evidence we've seen that people form more backward-looking inflation expectations. When you provide such projections that look more realistic, that have more cyclicality in them, people trust those projections more, but these lead to more volatile inflation dynamics because people start forming expectations either according to those projections or start best responding to those projections by forming more extrapolative expectations. And so from some of our earlier work, we concluded that it's better to just, in these sorts of settings, disregard people's irrationalities when constructing these projections because they may even encourage more unanchored inflation expectations.
Thank you.
So what we could conclude from these experiments is that the pandemic led to a decreased appetite for and a decreased tolerance of more precise communication and increased the efficacy of projections that also conveyed uncertainty. So we kind of step back from our earlier conclusions that these precise point projections were the way to go. If anything, people seem pretty confident or comfortable with some uncertainty around their projections. We saw this even stronger in Texas, where COVID was more severe, but also public confidence in their institutions, their government and health institutions, was lower than what we had in BC. And I don't talk about it here, but if you're interested, you can take a look at the paper. We also look at central bank credibility. And what we found was that in this period of, at the start of the pandemic, people were actually more forgiving of central bank forecast errors when it was conveyed with uncertainty than when it was conveyed with precision. So kind of reversing our earlier results. Now, so these are in the lab, and it's unclear, how much external validity is there to these? Sorry, am I getting a lot of background? Okay. How externally valid? Yeah.
Yeah. So regarding this result on the forgiveness of the central bank in times of uncertainty. So is it maybe that people are forgiving when they observe that the economy is uncertain for everybody? And maybe before they thought that uncertainty is more about the competence. These forecast errors was about the competence of the central bank to forecast the economy. And now is really about the uncertainty of everybody and not about the competences.
So you would be saying that pre-pandemic people were, that's true. So that they are, so it could be
so
that
if they were seeing the central bank making errors or having forecast errors, they would think probably it is about their incompetence of doing better forecast. But now in times of crisis, they understand that the situation is difficult for everybody. So it's an uncertainty, it's a difficult period for everybody, not just for the central bank. So it's not about the competence of the central bank doing forecast.
Right.
I wonder if that is.
So Ryan and I, we reran these experiments at the oh no, we didn't do this post-pandemic, but in our earlier experiments, we reran these at the individual level as well to see how much people were using the projection for information content versus a strategic purpose. You know, other people are using this information, so I'll be more likely to use this information. And what we found there was that much of the content was much of the value in these projections was information content as opposed to a strategic coordination device. Now, that doesn't answer your question, but I see your point that it could be that there was increased uncertainty in what other people knew or didn't know about due to, or not in what they knew, but their own background uncertainty and their own comfort with or without the projections. And so it would have been useful here to actually look at this at the individual level as well, to kind of tease that apart. No, that's a fair point.
Another question related to that.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice maybe increased attention by, for instance, people spending longer times on thinking about the forecast and making their decisions?
We didn't see really much change in terms of the timing, that the amount of time it took to run these experiments. Yeah, they were very, there was very little difference in terms of the reaction time.
Okay, thanks.
Except within across COVID. But when people are presented with the point forecast or the point and density forecast, they do tend to take a little bit longer, but it's only a matter of seconds, not that much longer. So, you know, would these findings, this kind of comfort with uncertainty, hold up if we looked at a broader population? So to answer this, Olena Kostashin and I ran a survey experiment around the same time at the start of the pandemic in spring and fall 2020 to study how people would respond to communicated uncertainty and imprecision in inflation statistics. And we were interested in studying particularly three types of communication about targets and projections, either by a central bank or from professional private forecasters. We made use of Nielsen's Canadian home scanner panel, which tracks households over a very lengthy amount of time in two waves. So we surveyed them first in April 2020 and then followed up with them in December 2020 as background uncertainty dissipated due to COVID. In that first wave of the survey, we asked participants very standard questions about their 1 and 2 period ahead inflation forecast. We asked this as point forecast as well as point and density, as well as their interest rate outlooks, their forecast about income growth, and their nominal spending growth. The point of asking about income and nominal spending is that we also want to be able to connect to some sort of measure of real behavior, which we're still studying right now. We also collected information about their demographics and their financial literacy. We then randomized participants into one of 8 treatments. So in our control group, they received no additional new information. And then in our 7 subsequent treatments, they received 1 piece of information. And before we conducted further data collection on them. So we either showed them the most recent inflation statistics, the bank's target with or without bands. We showed them the bank's inflation forecast, which conveniently was 2% in 1 year ahead, or that forecast with a confidence interval around it. And then that should say of 90% chance of being between 1.4 and 2.6. As well as professional forecasters mean 1 year ahead forecast with and without a range. So after we provided them with that information, we then asked participants, were you aware of this information? Yes or no. And then we asked them to re-answer questions about their outlooks for inflation, interest rates, and income and spending growth. Okay. And we then followed up with them in December of 2020. We got about 400 of our 600 participants, so about 2/3 of our subjects back for that follow-up survey. And we also surveyed on a new set of participants we also elicited expectations from a new set of participants who had not received any information. That allowed us to control for whether being repeatedly asked the same expectations made a difference. So what do we find? There's a lot here to digest, so I'm gonna walk you through this. So consistent with this whole broad survey literature is that any information, any numerical low value information works well to anchor inflation expectations. We see that we can reduce forecasts, 1 year ahead inflation forecasts from about 4% to about 2.4% when you give people a professional forecaster's outlook with a range. Okay. Now, we see, if I have time, I can talk about it later, significant improvements in forecasts of people from demographics that have consistently unanchored inflation expectations. So women, lower income, lower educated individuals, and older people all form or have more significant, we see a larger effect on those participants' expectations than we do with males, highly educated, high income males. But consistently across the board, we see a reduction in forecast errors. And we see this not only for their point forecast, but also the mean and median of their subjective density forecasts. But consistent with the rest of this literature, by December, 8 months later, the effects of this have all worn off. Okay. We see, and I'll talk a bit later, a bit more impact from communicating about recent inflation or past inflation, but by and large, the effects of these interventions are not persistent. Now, what about uncertainty? We measure a person's uncertainty in their outlook by measuring the interquartile range of their density forecast. And again, we see really strong immediate effects on uncertainty. People feel more confident about their own forecasts when they're provided with some additional information. But it's not entirely clear whether the range plays much role in shaping their confidence in their forecast. So I'm going to look at that in more detail in a second. Moreover, though, we see that the probability that people form their inflation forecast in the central bank's targeted range increases substantially when they're provided with some information. So inflation forecasts are in that range of 1 to 3%, about 10 or 25 percentage points more likely when they're provided with some auxiliary information. But again, by wave 2, 8 months later, almost none of this information continues to have an impact. The only thing that does seem to help anchor inflation expectations in the long run is this past inflation. We see about the probability of participants' expectations being in that targeted range be 5% higher in this past inflation treatment. Okay, so but one thing to emphasize already at this point is that it didn't seem like people were scared off by statistics that included uncertainty in the range. We see pretty comparable improvements in, and if not maybe even better improvements in participants' forecasting when they're provided with a bit of uncertainty around their forecast. Okay. Now, so if you look at—
sorry, Luba, yes? There is now few things here in the chat. So Michael Lamla has a question whether the effects in wave 2 were really decaying or whether the participants just did stick to the posterior expectation they had in wave 1 and just did not update on the inflation target treatment again.
Did the effects in wave 2 really decay? Well, so what we see is both the control group and the control group significantly reduced their inflation expectations in December. And so we're not seeing a statistically significant difference in the control group and everybody else. And it's difficult for us to say at this point whether it was the information interventions wearing off or was just everybody in the broad economy forming more lower inflation expectations. So I can show you a picture to kind of make that more clear at the end, if I have time.
Okay.
But
just a primer on time, so it's 5 o'clock now.
Okay.
We also have a question by Richard. Let me quickly allow him to ask his. So Richard, you can unmute yourself now.
Sorry, it was my mistake.
Okay.
Well, if I've only got a few more minutes, let me just say quickly. We see that the benefits of communicate. We do see, that ranges do help to kind of anchor inflation forecast a bit, but where that's coming from is communicating this bank forecast with the range. But again, a lot of these effects wear off by wave 2, and they're not persistent. We see communicating the bank's forecast with some uncertainty around it. It also reduces to some extent the participants' disagreement and increases the probability that participants forecast in that targeted range. Likewise, with the professional forecasters, communicating with the range actually helps to kind of anchor expectations better. So again, it doesn't seem like there is a unwillingness to coordinate on or utilize information that's communicated with uncertainty. But one thing I want to just note, and I think is very important, is the consequences of talking about past inflation or recent inflation statistics. When you communicate in past inflation, you see higher inflation forecasts, both point forecast and the mean and median of participants' subjective distributions. You also see increased disagreement and a lower probability that the participants' expectations are in that targeted range in the short run. Okay, so that would be good reason not to talk about past inflation. What you see experimentally in the lab is that when people have access to historical information, they have a way of over extrapolating that inflation or that past statistic. And this leads to more unanchored inflation expectations. But what was intriguing to us is that when we get to wave 2, we see that those people who were exposed to information about recent inflation statistics actually form inflation expectations that are in that targeted range. So if I have to sum up here, our main conclusions from all this laboratory and survey work is that since the pandemic, there appears to be a greater appetite for statistics communicated with uncertainty. We see in the surveys that the benefits of communication wear off pretty quickly if it's not recommunicated to participants over and over again. In the lab, much of what's probably driving the successful performance of central bank communication, especially point forecast, is that it's being repeatedly provided to participants. Now, it's easier to continually communicate past inflation to people. People in laboratory settings we see are much more keen to look up and utilize information about the past. It might be perceived as more credible and easier to understand. Or perhaps it's just more relatable as the individuals have gone through that inflation experience themselves. But communicating past inflation isn't without consequences. As I showed, it can actually create higher inflation expectations or more unanchored inflation expectations. And as central banks start to entertain alternative mandates like average inflation targeting or other history-dependent mandates like price level targeting, this can interact poorly with such mandates. And a lot of the laboratory work that Olena Kostashina and I have been doing lately has been showing that when you're dealing with such history-dependent mandates, it may be better to communicate with projections or something that, as opposed to emphasizing historical information. So I'll wrap up here. And if there are any further questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks a lot, Luba. I think there's some coming in right now. Let me quickly sort of mention something we've been working on here at the ECB, which I think is very related. So we also ran an experiment with our consumer expectation survey where we gave people the ECB's target, and then also looked at effect on credibility, effect on inflation expectations, and it was all there. It all disappeared 3 months later when we re-interviewed them. The one control group that we had where these effects were very persistent, even 6 months later, even when inflation started increasing a lot, was a group where we gave the target and we also gave an explanation. So we told them what the target is good for and why you need it and why it helps in the current economic circumstances. So maybe, you know, this is something that helped people understand better, just be beyond being a number being thrown at them.
So
and for
providing
those guys,
some more context.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think we see that in scenario so likewise in the lab, when we're trying to get people to understand history dependent mandates, we find that projections alone don't work, but you need to really explain the logic behind the policy actions and the objectives of the central bank. So that suggests an important role for central banks to communicate the motivations behind their frameworks more.
Right. Thank you. So Athanasius has also raised his hand. Athanasius?
Thank you, Michael. It's very nice work, Luba. Very happy to hear this. I wanted to ask about something. Michael brought it up like 45 minutes ago in one dimension. I would like to deepen the question, make it more precise, and see if you can do some work on that going forward. So in thinking about communication, it's been some time now. This relates to what should central banks communicate, and some of the people who are working with at the Fed, we're trying to develop this rule of thumb that it's probably best to communicate things that the central bank knows most about, and it's probably not a good idea to be communicating things that make the central bank where the central bank is not as confident that it knows more about markets or anybody else out there. This, by the way, may be one of the reasons why, what you mentioned about the Bank of Canada, I see it's entirely sensible that they would be reluctant to provide a forecast when they were as ignorant as anybody else around, and maybe this is what makes sense. So the precise question for you is the following. Let's start from a model where the central bank doesn't have the right model either. This is what Michael was asking before. So nobody has the right model. You have the right model as the modeler, and then you give the central bank a variation of the model with some errors, okay? And then you ask the central bank the following. You guys produce a forecast for inflation 5 years out and provide that. You always provide that. And then see what market participants do in your experiment, what your forecasters or the private sector is doing. And then you ask the central bank, by the way, provide now in addition your interest rate projection. And then provide both the inflation and the interest rate projection. They give that to market participants. Question I would want to have is that a useful thing to have? This would be a setting where you can actually see whether ignorance on the central bank side about the economy would be a reason the central bank would want to just focus on inflation as opposed to providing additional information, as some central banks do, whether the informational requirements for making the provision of more detailed information, like I say interest rates, many central banks provide that, useful or useless. There is this tension. When is it that information provided by the central bank is useful because it's informative, and when it's actually counterproductive because it's distracting? So that's, I think you can get very close to that in your experiments if you enrich the model in that dimension.
I agree, and I think the nice thing about, so in one way, the experiments reduce the complexity because there's only one or a couple of variables that they have to focus on in the economy, and information is presented probably in a very focused way, and so it's in many experiments, very easy to pay attention to the information, but you can easily study questions of rational attention and cognitive complexity in these frameworks. Related to your question about what information is useful and not useful in these environments. In some of my earlier work with Fatima Mokhtarzadeh, we looked at, and Oleksiy Krivstov, we've looked at the value of communicating interest rate projections as opposed to inflation projections. And these also contain valuable pieces of information that participants can use to form their forecasts. But we find them unwilling to use that information because it's not obvious how to use that easily to inform inflation. Participants have difficulty taking that interest rate information and using it to construct an inflation outlook. So what we've kind of concluded from earlier work is that if you want to communicate, you've got to communicate as simply as possible, and in the variables that you want to well manage. So if you want to manage inflation expectations, communicate about inflation. Don't communicate so much about output or interest rates, because people won't know how to use that to inform their inflation expectations. But I take your point. There's a lot one can do with these laboratory environments to study how people utilize information, depending on the complexity of the space.
Okay, and then there's one more question here in the chat that relates to sort of what people observe out there in the real world is, of course, not only the projections, but also the actions of central banks, right? So to what extent can that then sort of influence also their expectations?
So how much would central banks' actions in terms of we haven't disentangled that. We tend to keep the central bank's actions as determined by a policy rule. And we don't typically in lab experiments have the central bank behave in a discretionary way or deviate from their policy approach. Okay, and part of the reason in this experimental literature that we haven't looked at that is because there's an aversion in laboratory experiments to mislead participants. But it would be very interesting to study if a central bank deviates from what its general framework, how would that later influence the credibility of the central bank? And or as the central bank is moving between different kinds of policy frameworks, whether people become more dependent or in need of central bank communication to help form their forecast as they're engaging in an uncertain world. But you have to do it delicately in a lab experiment in such a way that you don't mislead the participant in any way. You could do this in such a way that you could just be very vague about this of a policy framework, or allow for the possibility of the central bank to deviate. But so those are great questions, but they haven't yet been explored much in the laboratory settings. And if the central bank communicates sources of risks instead of just the numerical projections, may help people understand. Certainly, and I can imagine, as Michael is saying, describing in his own experiments, providing more, qualitative explanation about what's going on in the economy, the risks to the economy, I think certainly would help to improve the likelihood that a person sits down and reads the statements that a central bank is making, as well as it probably is likely to increase the credibility or the trust in the central bank.
Okay, so I think we landed exactly at 75 minutes. So thank you very much, Luba. Again, this was a fantastic talk. Thanks for making it now this time around. And thank you everyone for attending.